Thanks, John. Thanks so much. Just to say one other thing in terms of format. So we'll have the presentation and some time for discussions until 6 o'clock. And then what we're going to have after that is 30 minutes as a network to which people are very welcome to stay to talk about the development of the Therapy and Social Change Network. But I'm really delighted to introduce Matt and Jennifer just very quickly from Compassion in Politics. When I was working on the book that I've done recently, I came across their work, and it was quite late in the book, but I was just absolutely gobsmacked by the quality of the work that they're doing. It's so exciting, I think, as a way of exploring that interface between ideas from the therapeutic field, particularly around compassion. I know that they've been working with Paul Gilbert around compassion-focused therapy, and some of his ideas have come into that. To look at how we can really bring that into the social change field and think about right at the heart of politics, these ideas that are so central to the work that we do in therapy. I've worked my way all the way through the book, How Compassion Can Transform Our Politics, Economy and Society, which is just a great book, and there's some fantastic chapters in there that people might want to have a look at in terms of the work, and maybe John, somebody can put the link in there. So Matt and Jennifer are both co-directors of Compassion in Politics, and I've got these amazing backgrounds. Jennifer's chair of a new group, which is a Global Compassion Coalition. She might say something about that as well as being co-director of Compassion in Politics. She's a qualified barrister. She's an author. She wrote the Sunday Times bestseller We, which was co-authored with Gillian Anderson. And it's a roadmap for individual societal change. Really exciting work, and she's also been a broadcast journalist. And then Matt's led a number of social environmental justice campaigns. He was part of the Nobel Peace Prize winning team at the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, which lobbied the UN to introduce a ban on nuclear weapons. And most recently, he's managed the Equal Civil Partnership campaign, which secured the introduction of civil partnerships for mixed-sex couples, which is such important work. So it's great to have them with them. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jennifer. As I said, we'll have about 30-40 minutes or so of presentation, some questions, and then we'll bring things to a close by 6. But there should be lots of time for people to ask questions and get involved. And John's going to keep an eye on the chat if there's things that come up, and then we can put them to Jennifer and Matt as well later, as well as if people want to come off their minds. Jennifer.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and it's so exciting to be with you all, and I hope you've all read Mick's book, which is absolutely fantastic on this subject, and thank you, Mick, for mentioning ours. I thought as we're psychologists here, I'm not a psychologist, I like to think I am, but I'm not. I would talk a little bit about my own background and my own story, and just the role that synchronicity plays, and also the unknown plays. So I grew up in the UK thinking that I had a father and a mother who had come from the States, and he was an academic, and I grew up with a burning sense of injustice, and I ran my first campaign when I was in my teens, an anti-road campaign, long before that was a thing. And I just had a special need for people who were incarcerated to have a voice. So my career path was, as Mick said, that I became, I qualified as a barrister, then got to the bar, and somehow, despite having studied the law for 4 years, hadn't taken on board that it wasn't really about truth and justice. It was about applying a set of rules which really perpetuated a system of injustice and weren't there to divine really the truth or have any compassion, but just whether or not someone had obeyed or disobeyed a particular rule. So I left pretty quickly and decided to become a journalist. And I ultimately became ITN's Home Affairs editor, where I got to really be a campaigning journalist. They were a wonderful organization to work for. And I could choose issues that it was obvious to me that there was an injustice, or I did a lot on prisoners who had been wrongly incarcerated, both in the UK and across the world, and you know, had a camera and a microphone. But I increasingly became uncomfortable about some of the the trade-offs I had to do as a journalist. You know, we're parachuted into people's lives, we persuade them to tell stories, and then we're off onto the next story. Meanwhile, they live with the consequences of having publicly talked about often some very intimate things. And ultimately, I ended up leaving journalism and going into direct activism. At about this time, I discovered that my father wasn't a normal American academic. He had in fact been a child refugee who had fled to the UK on the kinder transport and had then been wrongly taken to Australia and incarcerated in a prisoner of war camp, his only crime having been that he had an Austrian passport because he was fleeing the Holocaust. And so, unbeknownst to me, my drive to try and make things fair and just, my father had a great wrong to him done that I had no knowledge of, and yet had somehow driven my life's purpose. Anyway, I left journalism and I went directly into active campaigning, which is how I met Matt, who you're going to hear from in a minute. And I started by direct interventions, protests, all of those things that feel incredibly satisfying, because one always feels less powerless when one is taking action. And then I went into the Green Party, sat on the National Executive and ran for Parliament a couple of times. And what I really discovered through the activism and through being involved directly in politics was that there was a lot of toxicity, there was a lot of shadow, and if anything, it was far more pronounced. The more righteous the cause, the more pronounced the shadow was. So the levels of toxicity that one encounters are almost in inverse proportion to how wonderful the cause is, and that was really disappointing. So I took a step back and just it was absolutely, I found it too toxic to work in. Although I still believed in all the causes, the machinery that one was obliged to engage with in order to try and further these causes, similar to the law, obliged one to do things that one didn't agree with morally and ethically in order to try and achieve an outcome that felt right. And so I took a step back, and by that time, Gillian Anderson had become a friend. And so we wrote a book called We, which was really looking at what internal work do we need to do before we engage in the outside political change-making movement. You know, what damage are we bringing? And during my time as a campaigner, I've watched the trauma bonding that happens. I've watched people appropriating other people's suffering, and I've watched the role of the ego. I've seen how fear dictates responses that are not really in any way aligned with the morality and ethics of a particular cause. And so I really took a step back and just tried to consider, what are the things that we need to heal in order to be robust enough to enter the political space without bringing our own damage into the equation and our own family script into the equation. And by that time, the political system was becoming pretty toxic as a whole, not just within the movements, but as we know, we had Brexit, Trump in America. Matt and I were talking, you know, what is the way forward? How can we achieve change if we don't go through conventional party structures, which have the problems I've just described? And we decided that all these single issue campaigns that we'd both worked on were really all linked by one underlying cause. So whether it was refugees drowning at sea, whether it was homelessness, whether it was the growth in child hunger, whether it was climate crisis, they were all connected by the same underlying cause, which was the absence of compassion. And if we could somehow inject compassion back into the political space, we could then raise the tide so that all that flotilla of social change organizations would have a much greater chance of achieving their respective goals. So we decided to take a look at how that would work, and we decided to just play a straight bat at it, and we set up Compassion in Politics. And the first reaction that we really got was a lot of cynicism, a lot of, well, there's an oxymoron. But actually, the truth was, once that cynicism was got out of the way, there was an incredible hunger for it. And you know, our analysis of the political system was that if you look back really since 1979, compassion has been systematically edged out of the political space. You know, we have Margaret Thatcher, there's no such thing as society. We have Norman Tebbit, get on your bike, geographical mobility. We then have the Labour government getting involved, shopper benefit, cheat, helpline. And the steady snipping of the social contract, which had held us all together since the post-war settlement, along with a demonizing of those who fall upon hard times and need help as somehow unworthy or scrounging or cheating, was really allowed to take hold. And probably the cruelest bit for me is the way that the language of therapy has been used to almost complete that process, that if you help, you're somehow creating a dependency culture. So actually you shouldn't go and get involved because you're then creating dependency and you're becoming part of the problem, which of course works very well for humans who are scared of the messy business of getting engaged, because they now have a legitimate reason not to get engaged and actually to cross the road. And so we felt very strongly that we needed to reverse that process, or to open up the space where that process could be reversed and that compassion could be brought back in, and some of that very cruel and systematic othering of those who are in most need could happen, and people could remember that good fortune is a blessing, not something that is actually a reflection of their own internal merit. And so we set up Compassion in Politics. First of all, we set it up as an idea, and in our first, I'm going to hand over to Matt in a minute so that he can talk about the detail of what we've been doing. But our first goal was really just to get compassion and politics mentioned in the same sentence, to get this idea, you know, this anachronism that we were arguing for, that compassion did actually have a place in the political space, talked about, because we knew that first of all, compassion had to be seen as a legitimate political driver. And that involved having compassion and politics talked about in the same sentence in the political space. And Matt has, amongst many other things within the organization, ran the media campaign, and we had over 100 articles, and we're on the Today program when we launched. And that was really, really important to us, because how do we create change? First of all, by creating awareness. Anyway, I'm going to hand over now to Matt, and he can pick up the story there.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, John and Mick, for having us here. We're really humbled and delighted to be invited. I'm just going to switch my view so I'm not looking at my, I'm going to hide myself. Sorry, 1 second. I can't really seeing my.
You know, everyone's going to make all sorts of psychological analysis on the basis of that, don't you?
Maybe you can all message me afterwards with some tips. I mean, on that note, I do want to just say a huge debt of gratitude really to everyone who is in this space already and doing this research and this work, because it wouldn't, what we're doing now would never ever have been possible without those decades or years of research, that understanding, that drive to form a more scientific based approach to some of these issues that we've been grappling with. We are really indebted to you, and try to do as much as we can to take that message forward in a sensitive and accurate way as possible. Jennifer's had the joy of doing the interesting motivational visionary stuff, and I'm going to bore you with some details about processes and systems now. But the starting place, I suppose, for me is to consider what is the problem that we're dealing with, and I'm aware I'm speaking to an audience that probably is quite aware of these concepts, but just in case, we take an analysis which is quite heavily based on Paul Gilbert's concept of barriers to compassion, and looking at the ways in which our political system creates barriers to either feeling or acting with compassion. A quick snapshot tells you that it's performing pretty badly. If you think of barriers to compassion as being things like a lack of efficacy, MPs very often feel that they lack any kind of agency in the work that they do. They are subject to the whims of their party, to the prevailing popularity of ideas amongst the public, to the way that the media present them. Tribalism, I mean, you don't really need to say very more, except that our political system is exceptionally tribal and competitive compared to systems based across continental Europe, where you have systems of proportional representation. Ours really drives a wedge between two competing parties, makes them run in a horse race to the finishing line on election day, and it's very much a zero-sum outcome. Then we have the lack of clarity, is another cause for people to feel a lack of compassion, a lack of clarity over your role. MPs receive no training. They enter into Parliament, they're essentially forced to go and find a desk, connect the Wi-Fi, get a telephone, hire some staff, and then what do you do? This job is made for people to feel like they are being pulled and pushed and pulled apart in a lot of ways. And then a distance from the people who are suffering. And I think that is built into our politics in so many ways, not only the rules which allow politicians to collect salaries, which are quite astronomically different from those they represent, the fact that they all have to go and converge on London for a whole week when they may be actually living 200, 300 miles away. And the fact that they do all of that within the Palace of Westminster, this institution which has been handed down to us and is made to look like, a very elitist institution, where you have all these sort of strange traditions that no one on the outside really understands, makes people feel that amongst that system, very distant and different from those that they govern. So those are the areas where our analysis leads us to say, okay, there's a big problem here with potential absence of compassion, and the fact that we're seeing that borne out in the political decisions that get made, the way that debates happen. So to tackle that, moving on to more of the positive stuff, we take this view, our tagline is putting cooperation, inclusion and compassion at the heart of politics, variation on that order, different when I remember the correct one. Starting with cooperation, the main things that we have called for and in certain instances run campaigns on are the way that debates happen in Parliament. You may know that the two leaders in the House of Commons, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, they are deliberately positioned to be two swords lengths apart from one another, because the room was designed in a day when that might be the ultimate decision-making process by which a debate would get decided. And I use that only to say that that is the basic values that are lying still at the heart of our way our politics happens. You've got these two sides. They are deliberately very steeply opposed to one another. They are allowed to shout and holler and jeer, say things under their breath. You know, there's a competition to come up with the wittiest remark and insult. No professional workplace would allow decisions to be made like that, and yet we are allowing our representatives to make decisions in the national interest through that process. So we've called for an end to booing, jeering. The public, you probably won't be surprised to hear, when we've done polling, have backed us on that, but also for a different voting procedure. The process at the moment, whereby MPs essentially file through two different doors depending on whether they are voting aye or no on an issue, means that and it's been routinely reported that they get pushed and pulled, and then after the vote, it's seen how they voted. So members of their party will come up and shout and holler in their face for the way they've done that. It makes no sense to allow bullying to be a part of the way democratic decisions get made. So we've also called for the introduction of electronic voting, which happens in most council chambers across the country and in most parliaments across the world. It's just that ours is so anachronistic. Still on the subject of cooperation, whipping is another institutional artifact that we have inherited from, seems like, the Dark Ages. And in fact, a whip still hangs up in the room of the chief whip of the government. It is, in the past, it was a legitimised form through which physical violence could be used to get MPs to vote in a particular way. In the modern age, it's professionalised slightly, so it comes down to more like blackmail, putting an MP's office far away from the debating chamber, so they have to run there every time the division bell is sounded. The threat of leaking stories about them to the press, being told that their career is ended if they vote in a particular way. So while there needs to be some way of organising MPs in Parliament, we don't doubt that, we've called for a systemic review of the whipping process and the culture that underlines it. Moving on to inclusivity, there's a need to make Parliament feel inclusive, and there is a need to make the process by which people get into Parliament more inclusive, because we still have a situation in which 1/3 of MPs are women, clearly not reflective of the rest of society. And then you start looking at the numbers who have a disability or are from communities of colour, trans MPs. None of that is anywhere near being representative. But what we have focused a lot more on perhaps is probably just Parliament itself. The working hours are incredibly long. That's actually another barrier to compassion, because it creates an incredible amount of stress and distance from your family. Family life very often breaks down if you become an MP. Creating facilities so that there is a creche and childcare on site. There is a small childcare facility, but a very, very small one. Allowing newborns into Parliament. Stella Creasy MP is leading a campaign on that issue, which we are supporting. But we also just want to create an institution which actually brings people's voices and influence and views and realities into the political decision-making process. At the moment, we have one of the most heavily centralised political systems in Europe, with a great deal of power that could still be devolved down to local communities. But more than that, we could also be looking to really engage people on an individual level. So we've proposed the creation of constituency assemblies as sort of modification of the idea of citizens' assemblies. Citizens' assemblies are usually set up on an issue-specific basis. We think that you don't just need them on issues, you need them on the daily life that people are experiencing, and them to be able to influence what's happening in their local community. So the idea would be that a representative sample of the constituency would meet with their MP on a regular basis and have that opportunity for contact theory to work its usual magic, and allow people to see each other as humans and see people with different views as humans as well. The other aspect trying to make Parliament more inclusive is the working life of staff. Staff of MPs do not have a fully resourced, independent human resources department that they can call upon. So the reality of life for staff of MPs is that they are going to find themselves in one of 650 different small businesses, where the MP is in charge but has received no training on management necessarily. There's no compulsory training on management. Often find themselves subject to bullying, harassment, intimidation. Sexual harassment is not entirely uncommon, and then have no route through which to address those concerns, and in fact find themselves facing an institution which not only doesn't provide them with an avenue, but actually discourages them, because they don't want to upset their future career opportunity. They don't want to seem to be speaking out against their own party. If they're loyal to their MP, they're loyal to their party. So we've proposed creating an independent HR department that can deal with all of these things in a uniform, fair, professional, modern way. Lots of other organisations are also on board with this. And increasingly, thankfully, the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, is also in support and has recently launched a consultation on introducing an independent HR structure. Final thing is to actually put compassion as the vision, if you like, for politics, because I think, as Jennifer outlined, our sense was that politics is bereft almost of a vision. You know, people really need to feel that it's making a difference to their lives, that it's there to bring people together for the benefit of society. And at the moment, I'm not sure you'll find many people who think that is the purpose of politics. So we have proposed a number of policies which are really aimed at cementing that vision. First, and probably most important for us, is the idea of socio-economic rights. That's a slightly technical way of saying that anyone living in Britain should be able to feel safe, secure, and provided for. That should be a baseline for a compassionate society. And that right should extend into the future, i.e., we should try and create a world in which people are safe from the threat of climate change. And there is a way to put this into law. In fact, we have, as a country, signed up to doing so at the level of the United Nations. We have never introduced the domestic legislation required to make that happen. And we believe, and we're not alone in thinking this, that the worst excesses of austerity would never have been possible had we had that law in place. Along the way to that, we've run a few different campaigns that have aimed at chipping away at that idea. So we have run a campaign on getting the socioeconomic duty, which is a softer, slightly watered down version, incorporated into law. It's based on the Equality Act, and the Labour Party confirmed they will support that. We've also worked with Conservative MPs, actually a couple of Conservative MPs, on the recent campaign to raise minimum wage and benefits in line with inflation, which they did do. And actually, just circling back to the socioeconomic rights angle, Gordon Brown, in his recent policy report for Labour, also recommended that policy be supported by the party, so we're watching that closely. There was then one final campaign I thought is worth mentioning, because it doesn't sort of tie so quite closely into those strategic aspects, but it does talk to sometimes we can just be quite flexible and opportunist. And during the COVID lockdown, we ran a campaign to get hotels to provide rooms for people who would otherwise have been basically locked in with a domestic abuser. Hotels to open up their, at the time, vacant rooms. We wanted it nationwide. We didn't get it nationwide, but we did get it introduced in London, and ran that with Southall Black Sisters and the Mayor of London. Lastly, so that's the kind of, I suppose, the strategic what, and now I'm just going to talk very briefly about the strategic how. 5 main approaches. Jennifer's outlined one, which is simply to get compassion and politics talked about in the same sentence through the media. The second is to bring MPs together who support this idea, because, as I said, they're in an institution which pulls their values in different directions. They think about career, what their constituents want, what their leader wants, how do they appear. So we feel that there's a role to play in simply bringing them together and reinforcing the values that lie at heart of why they entered politics, which is why we set up an all-party group for compassionate politics, which is wonderfully co-chaired by Debbie Abrahams and Baroness Varzi. So we deliberately made that cross-party. We conduct research. We do this largely through polling. We do a lot of polling on public opinion around values and the role of compassion and the policies that would result from a more compassionate government. But crucially, we also try and take the research that's been done by wonderful people like yourselves and give that the public airing that it deserves. And we do things like letters from communities of psychologists, or when there's new research coming out, we try and get it placed in the media. And we're always open to doing that. Comment pieces similarly as well. We're trying to create an environment as well that is conducive to compassion in Parliament. So we offer training in compassion to what we're trying to offer it to MPs. We have so far, Jennifer has so far been in and trained staff in Parliament as well as a number of NGOs to try and cultivate and boost their compassion levels. And then the last thing is we try and organise routine events. We also have had a podcast series which just gives an airing to these ideas and makes sure that they're being talked about by MPs as much as possible. I probably have missed things, but I've also probably talked too long. So I'm going to pass back to Mick and John, and I think we're opening the floor up to questions, if that's right.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Matt and Jennifer. I just think it's extraordinary. I really think it's extraordinary the work that you're doing in terms of bringing these values and making a difference to the environment, the world that we're in. It's phenomenal. So what we thought is, if people have got comments or questions, things that they want to ask or things that they want to say, either you can come off mute or you can put it in the chat, or probably the best is if you put your electronic hand up. John, do you want to say how people can do that? And then that's how we know who wants to say something. And then we've...
Yeah, that can work well. So there's a little reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom panel. Click on the reactions button and you should see an option to raise hand. And then that can give us a little queuing system. Great. Victoria, you've got it working, so that's really great. And then Sebastian can unmute. We can get a bit of a conversation going, and then let's come to the next person. So yeah, should we start with Victoria?
Yep.
Okay, let's get you unmuted, Victoria.
Hi there, thanks for the talk. It was really fascinating. I've heard Jennifer speak recently, I think, on another online event with Mick, which is why I'm here. It's really fascinating, and thanks for the work that you're doing. So you say that you do training in compassion, and I was just wondering what that actually consists of and how you've kind of formulated that training. What is it based on and how does it work?
It's an amalgamation of lots of different practices, but it's fundamentally 4 pillars of self-care, because Matt talked about the barriers to compassion. You know, in order to connect with one's own authentic values, one needs to feel emotionally safe and secure to do so. One needs not to be tormented by, the buzzing bees of self-criticism and self-doubt in one's head. One needs to be able to have a clear, empathetic response to the suffering of others. So we really look at 4 forms of self-care relating to those different sides. So meditation, critical self-talk, positive affirmation, and gratitude. And the 4th is physical self-care, because so often when, I've experienced it myself when I was a journalist, when you're trying to get someone out of jail, and MPs' offices on a daily basis are barraged with people who are suicidal, who have lost loved ones, who have people in severe states of trauma and distress. They have no training to handle that whatsoever. And they're expected to switch between the extraordinary emotional labor that involves and potential vicarious trauma, and then functioning intellectually and preparing research. So we first of all, we need to support those working in the field to take care of themselves and to create an inner safe space, and to learn to park those difficult emotions, and also just basic psychosocial education. What happens when we're triggered? How do we know when we're in a fight or flight state? How do we personally self-soothe effectively? What are the techniques that we're going to use to return ourselves to center when we have been triggered? Those kind of things.
Can I just ask, there was a question here in the chat from Abel, which I think really relates to this. They say, I'm curious what the reception uptake has been like for the compassion training. Do you want to maybe say a little bit about what kind of response you've got? I know you mentioned it briefly.
I might cry when I say it. It's been so incredibly moving. The response has been wonderful, and we have people reaching out after the training wanting to continue the work. And I think also just that we recognize the working conditions that they're in, the working environment that they're in, and the emotional part of it, because they literally you know, it's the equivalent of becoming a Samaritan or possibly even a counsellor without any training whatsoever or any preparation whatsoever. And it's a tough environment, and you're not meant to be emotional. You've got to be tough if you want to work in that environment. And in addition, you know, there's a lot of internal bullying that happens within it, because as we know, we have 650 MPs, and there are no, as Matt has, you know, said, no real there's no independent HR to offer any protection. And if your boss is incredibly stressed and they're taking it out on you, there's nowhere to go if you want to keep your job.
Thanks, Jennifer. I was just noticing Kim was saying, I'm moved to surprise tears just to hear all this. Hadn't realised just how miserable I've been at the state of politics in the country. I think, you know, Matt, when you were talking about how broken things are, it really feels that. And I think you were really putting your finger on, you know, just like, I guess for us working in the therapeutic field, we're used to a particular set of values and a particular way of doing things. But the reality in the political world, as you and Jennifer are saying, is very, very different from that, isn't it?
And I think, yeah, and thank you for that comment, Kim. I think sometimes those moments of reflection, they can be helpful and scary at the same time. But I think for us, it was this real need to find an understanding of what it was that was driving it. And obviously there are multiple competing factors. I mean, I didn't reflect, for example, on the role of the media, which we're often asked about. And I'm sure some people are thinking in the back of their heads as well, where that plays in. But I think trying to take that psychological look at the way Parliament works has been really eye-opening for us, and I hope others will also, you know, bring new ideas and reflections to that, and certainly get involved in trying to push it into a much more psychologically informed way of working.
I get a sense that there's a kind of twin focus. Part of it is about how compassion in how politics are done, and then developing political policies and procedures that are compassionate. It's like you're doing both, aren't you?
Yeah, and that was quite deliberate. I mean, I think probably where we're going to have, I mean, Jennifer may disagree with me on this. I feel like where we're going to have the most impact is in those changes to the way politics works, because that's the long-standing institutional structural problems that we're all dealing with. But we've been moved always to have that vision, because I think you need to show the kind of place you're aiming towards, and added to which it's very hard to ignore some of the real pressure points of suffering that are going on all the time. So, you know, if you're setting up to run a compassion politics organisation, you need to have an eye on that as well.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions here in the chat that are kind of maybe related or just thoughts about policy. So one is, what are your thoughts about campaigning for a universal basic income? And then there's another one, which is that the period over which you've described compassion being squeezed out of politics is also the period where neoliberal economic worldview and policies come to the fore. To what extent do you feel these two trends are connected, and how do you see the interaction between the two in your current work?
I can pick up on the second one. We think they're completely connected. You know, we have all been sold a lie that the more we have, the better we'll feel. And everyone in this room knows that that's absolutely not true. And, you know, the project of neoliberalism has been to create as few frictions as possible to the maximization of profits. And we also work with business increasingly. And, you know, there's a very interesting report from the Royal Society? I always forget, or is it the Royal Academy? Whichever.
Are we talking about the working one, the business one?
I'm talking about the future of the corporation, which was this incredibly august report that had every single business and economics academic on its board. And what it pointed out was that, you know, it's only since 1961 that companies have been obliged to put profits before purpose. It's a relatively short period in our history. It's not that we have to do away with corporations. It's that we have to remember how they were initially thought of. And if one looks at the work of corporations like Cadbury and, Guinness in terms of their responsibility to the communities in which they operated. You know, neoliberalism has completely unhooked social responsibility and social purpose and built everything around the purpose of profit, which increasingly now, thankfully, we have the B Corp movement that's shifting away from that. And, you know, one of the things that you know, terrible events like the pandemic or the Ukrainian war remind us is, you know, what really matters. Most of the time, we're living in this environment where we've come to believe that things matter that absolutely do not have any real meaning to our innermost being. And that is the results of neoliberalism. They've divorced us from our inner values and what truly brings satisfaction. Matt?
I'll sort of pick up on that and then go on to the UBI question. I think absolutely, for me, that there's kind of been a turbocharging because of neoliberalism. I think, like I described, a lot of those structures that are problematic in politics have existed for many hundreds of years, but they almost were kind of kept in politics, if you like. Whereas I think with the advent of 24-hour media, and the other forms of media that we now have, the sort of personalization of politics, that ideology has seeped into every aspect of our life, and politics is now a neoliberal game, and work is a neoliberal game. So it was already there and it was already possible. But yeah, it's had this sort of extra dose given to it since the late 70s. But we're trying to always say there is another possibility. Humans are a multitude of possibilities, and the way that we structure our society will be a reflection of the values that we choose to bring to it. On the UBI question, yes, is the short answer. We have actually worked with a number of the groups who are campaigning for UBI. We've done, I think, at least a couple of media things with them. We don't prioritize it proactively simply because there's loads of great groups doing that work already, but it feels like it's the most natural policy that follows from having socioeconomic rights in law, because what's the simplest way to ensure everyone is catered for and cared for is to have a UBI.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you a quick follow-up question on that, and maybe it's quite a tricky one. I mean, when you were saying about neoliberalism, and Jennifer, you're very clearly saying that you see it's problematic, how do you then feel about working with, say, politicians who are on the right or on the far right, who are then advocating kind of neoliberal policies? Because I guess one of the challenges around compassion is to be compassionate with those who aren't necessarily advocating compassion themselves.
Absolutely. And you know, one of the things that I love about working with the value of compassion is that compassion is founded on equality, that the equal worth of every human, irrespective of their views and irrespective of their policies. And I think it's really important to separate people from the policies they espouse. And if one takes a psychological framework, you know, policies are the product of you know, early childhood experiences, damage, other psychological motivations. You know, we know that the safer people feel, the more expansive their political views are. So I saw someone in the chat had posted about, you know, boarding school trauma, early childhood trauma leads to a cutting off from an emotional response to suffering very often. So we have to work with compassion. But one of the extraordinary things, with a few notable exceptions, is that when you sit down and talk to a politician and go back to that moment that they decided to go into politics, what motivated them, almost without exception, it's a desire to make the world a better place. And what happens is that then people develop ideologies that they become attached to, and they meet their unmet psychological needs for identity, belonging, visibility, mirroring through these tribal groups. But actually beneath that is a longing to do something worthwhile and something that's good. So it's always very heartening when we sit down with someone. We had one extraordinary conversation with a Conservative MP. We went to his office and his female assistant served us tea with a silver tea pot and strainer. and it was very formal, and you know, this poor woman was clearly there to wait on the MP. But when we said, what do you think we should do about the economic crisis, he says it's obvious, we need to pay people a decent living wage. And there we had this very patrician Conservative who was heartbroken about the circumstances in which much of the nation were living, but didn't have a voice within his own party to express that. So we could then work with him, and we hope or think that that might have been one of the multiple things that led to that being included in the budget.
Thank you. I just want to read something from Nicholas. He says, thank you, Jennifer and Matt, for your work. I'm struck that you aren't just asking politicians to be more compassionate, you're extending compassion to the politicians first. I imagine that is a very powerful intervention to politicians who are starved of compassion themselves. I think that's exactly what you're saying. Rebecca, did you want to come in there? Sorry, I'm doing my best to kind of follow it. And
Yeah, no, thank you for that. The talk was fascinating, and as somebody who used to work in local government, I really sympathize with this need to kind of see the humanity in our elected representatives as well. But I think the thing that strikes me is that the difficulties in compassion are not just at the sort of policy level or government level, but they're also at the grassroots level. And that's, you know, perpetuated by the culture of scarcity and, you know, cost of living, and so many people feeling that they don't have enough, and living in a state of sort of chronic anxiety. And I suppose, I don't know whether it's a question or just a comment or just a thought out loud about how we match the kind of work at that policy level in spreading awareness about compassion with doing work at the grassroots level. And here we are all as therapists working on sort of compassion towards self and others with individuals. But for me, there's something about doing that work at community level as well that we need to be really focused on. And I've struggled to know quite how we do that in the most effective way.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The couple of things I was going to just say in response is, one, that, yeah, I mean, I sort of almost left out this massive piece about the socioeconomic circumstances that we're in and how that makes people feel and approach political issues and approach one another. We try and bring that through. I mean, when we've done sort of response work to incidents where MPs have been abused or attacked, you know, we try and throw that light on. The solutions can't just be locking down our politics. It has to be thinking about the whole picture and how we make society more inclusive, and people, like Jennifer was saying, feel more warm-hearted and open-minded. And that's about creating that sense of safety and community. I think in terms of your question also about how we make that possible at a bigger level, I know there was a question in the chat as well about the one heart at a time versus the sort of systemic change. I mean, I wish I could have a really simple answer to that. We focused our work on politicians to start with, partly because that was the strategic decision that we made. It was to do with resource size of the organisation. We really started in 2018. But I think our vision for the future of compassion in politics would certainly be that you would have those community groups, like I described, working with their MP, reaching out, forming connections locally, and creating those bridging points between the work their MP does and the people that they are there to serve, as well as changing that institution itself that they're working. I think I've been struck by the number of comments from people saying, you know, the reflection that you have on the way that your MP, the situation that MPs are in. And I think it has been something we've learned as you go through this process, that is worth remembering. They are quite trapped, and their efficacy and their agency is quite low. That they are in a very difficult situation and a very difficult system. Now, that's not to excuse some of the decisions that get made, but it is to try and explain it. And I think we have to deal with those root causes if we're going to make any long-term change.
Yeah. There's also something in there about culture as well. You know, that's part of the neoliberal design, was to change our culture, the legitimization of greed, the ease with which we reach for hate and blame and shame. And, you know, as ecologists will tell you, to grow a new plant evolves alongside the old dying plant. But how do we grow compassion and live by the values that most of us practice in our homes and in our interpersonal relationships? You know, how do we take those beyond the home? And in doing that, how do we see that as an act of political defiance as well? Because one of the things that leaves us all feeling so depressed and often disengaged or just hostile to politics is the feeling that we have no agency. But we do have agency, and the moment one starts to exercise that agency, and no matter how small a way, the energy begins to shift.
So I really wanted to follow up on that because I'm just aware of the time. And there's a comment by Darren saying, I'll be honest, I have no idea where to start. What can I as a therapist working alone do to help bring about positive change? And there was another comment from Elaine saying, thank you so much for tonight. After the therapeutic hour, I can talk about how insights can be sustained outside of therapy, but it'd be interesting to hear follow-ups and see where change is happening. I think a real key question for us as a community is like, what would you say that we can do? What's the kind of call to action to follow this up? There's obviously your organisation, the website. John, maybe we can put in the chat the links to Compassion in Politics. What can we do to work with you, to support you, to be alongside you? Because I think, like many people out, it's just fantastic what you're doing.
You're going to let me go first, Jennifer, because I think it is a tough question, right? And we struggle on you know, working out exactly where our main pressure points are for change. So I mean, it's firstly to say, if you're wondering how to get involved in sport, it's a difficult question. I think when we did the book and I did the chapter on this section, I sort of broke it down into those individual parts. So there's the first part, which is just what you do on an individual day-to-day basis, which I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but obviously reminding and practicing those acts of compassion is remembering that it is a political act when everything else in society tells you to behave quite differently, to be competitive, to be in conflict, to see people as other competitors for resources. So don't forget your agency and the role that you're playing just by doing that. You have power in voting. I was at a conference this week, and someone asked the same question to a member of the panel, and they simply said, stop voting for bullies, which I wish was as simple as that, because sometimes our choices are limited by the political system. But I think look for those organizations, after looking at Compassion in Politics, that are looking at the systemic changes that we need to make. So things like voting reform campaigns and changes to the way that politics is representing different communities, because I think those are the ones that really work at the deep level. We are always looking to promote the research and work that people are doing. So if you want to contact us afterwards, that would be wonderful. We're also looking for anyone who wishes to sort of volunteer with us on producing briefings, on doing further research, on organising panels and events with politicians where we can actually show them the science and show them how there is a better way of working. One of the most popular panels we did was on the psychology of politics. So looking at those kinds of opportunities as well. We are not a hugely well-endowed organisation, so we often do just try and provide the resources in terms of ideas and feedback and support to others who want to self-organise. We would rather be in a position where we could create those structures ourselves, but at the moment, that's the way people often work. They come to us with an idea and we say, yeah, amazing, we'll support you to do that. So as an example, we've had groups set up internationally in different countries for compassionate politics there, but we also want to do that by interest and issue group as well. Jennifer, do you have anything more on what people can be doing?
think, I mean, the first basic thing is to sign up, because the more members we have, the more influence we have, the more power we have, and we do have regular actions that need taking. And if you sign up, you'll be on our newsletter, and we'll tell you when you need to contact your MP. We'll tell you when something's happening that you need to know about. And we may also make you feel more hopeful just occasionally. But I think two other things. One is that we're looking to expand our training scheme, and if there are any volunteers who would like to help us do that, that would be amazing. We like to provide our services free so that groups can turn to us and money not be an object. So we work a lot with campaigning organisations that are run on a shoestring and are often right in the front line at that intersection between other people's trauma and their own advocacy. And finally, just, we have choices every day that, as Matt said, are political acts. And I think, reminding everybody that we're never powerless. How we spend our money, whether we smile at someone, whether we stop, whether we cross the road. Connection, our theory of change is that there are 3 stages: connection, then building capacity, and then taking action. So connection is the first stage. And obviously, everyone on this call knows about the value of connection, but we can practice it in every aspect of our lives, not just in our consulting rooms.
I saw, Mick, just to come in, I saw John very kindly posted the sign up. There is, if you go to simply the homepage, obviously we're really welcome people who want to sign up as members. If you just simply want to join to get the email, you can also do that for free just by going to the homepage of our website. Someone else also asked about signing up to volunteer. At the moment, we don't have like a sort of volunteer scheme, but if you simply drop an email to info@compassioninpolitics, we will definitely come back to you because we want all the help we can get.
Brilliant. And that email address is on the website, so people can find.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for coming along, Matt and Jennifer. I think it's been amazing to hear about the work that you do and what you're taking forward and what difference that you're making to what's happening into politics. How do we do a round of applause, John? Do we have a cheering thing?
I think we can unmute everyone for a moment. So anybody, Sebastian, can you do that? Open the mics and we can have a round of applause. Let's see. Yeah, here we are.
Brilliant, great.
Can I just say thank you to you? It's been such a pleasure.
I think we just need to mute the mics. Sorry, Jennifer.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to you for having us here and everyone who's in the room. It really replenishes us when we're in community like this. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Yes, thank you so much for hosting and being such wonderful questions and all that you're doing anyway as well.